Hello everyone, my name is Shawn Haq. I'm the founder and chief executive officer of the Millennial Institute for Political Awareness and Engagement. Today we're going to be interviewing Bryan Caforio. He's running for the United States House of Representatives in the 25th District of Congress. He graduated from Yale Law School, worked for a federal judge, and for the past 7 years he's practiced law as a consumer protection attorney. He's running against Republican incumbent Congressman Steve Knight in a race that is one of the most high-profile races in California. Just a couple of days ago, President Obama endorsed Bryan. Congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
And polling shows that it's very competitive. It's a toss-up, so whether the seat will remain Republican or become Democratic really just bears on how well turnout is on November 8th. So no pressure, but in all seriousness, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for everybody here for being engaged. It's wonderful to be talking to young people who care about the process and working to get more people engaged to try to improve our process and get better representatives.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah. So we're going to dive right in. We're going to start off with an issue that is very important, but oftentimes doesn't get discussed enough, and that's women's issues. Now, the first question is also going to be a very contentious one. Now, your opponent, Congressman Knight, has voted in Congress to defund Planned Parenthood and to prohibit abortion after the 20-week mark. As a Democrat running in a relatively moderate district, how do your views on these two issues differ from his?
We couldn't be more apart on these issues. Congressman Knight not only has taken those positions, he actually opposes a woman's right to choose in all circumstances. So even in cases of rape, in cases of incest, in cases where the mother's life is at risk, he opposes a woman's right to make those decisions. I proudly stand with Planned Parenthood. We have a Planned Parenthood facility in our community. It's up in the Antelope Valley. It provides care for 13,000 women in our community every year with life-saving cancer treatment, medical screenings, etc. And Congressman Knight wants to take that away. We need to make absolutely certain that we keep government out of women's health care decisions, give women, along with their families and their doctors, the ability to make their own decisions and decide what they want to do with their lives and their health.
Okay. So it's very clear that you want to protect a woman's right to choose. But you talked about that Planned Parenthood in Antelope Valley, and to my understanding, that's the only Planned Parenthood in this congressional district. Right?
It is the only one in the district. There's another one that is located in Thousand Oaks that provides services to many women who do live in the district, but it's not located in the 25th.
Okay. So my question is, how are you going to expand access to this birth control, cancer screenings, and health care for women in the district and across the nation?
Sure. So, first step is making sure that these facilities remain funded. Mm-hmm. Second step is making sure that we have policies in place that don't allow employers to discriminate against women. And right now we've had Supreme Court cases. We have, Congressman Knight actually co-sponsored a piece of legislation that would allow an employer to fire a woman if she takes birth control, or to fire a woman if she gets pregnant while single. So we're now going beyond just talking about rolling back Roe v. Wade, which he wants to do. He actually wants to roll us back to the 1950s and make it so that a woman can be fired if she makes these personal decisions. I think that's wrong. I think that it's very, very clear when women thrive, America succeeds, and we need to make sure we are advancing policies that are pro-woman, pro-family, and giving women the opportunity to make their own decisions about how and when they want to participate in our economy and to decide on their own terms those family planning issues.
Absolutely. So you talked a little bit about discrimination, gender discrimination in the workplace. One of the most contentious issues with regards to that is the wage gap. In 2015, women earned 80 cents for every dollar a man made. Now, I believe in 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed, and it mandated that men and women in the same workplace receive equal pay for equal work. Obviously, that isn't happening. What type of legislation would you sponsor to make sure that women do get equal pay for equal work, and how would it differ from the 1963 Act?
Sure, and actually you brought up some good facts, but that actually doesn't tell the whole story, because for women of color, it's even less. They're making way less than 80 cents on the dollar. Right. California actually just passed a real good law on this. For paycheck fairness, for equal pay for equal work, and what it does is it provides a better mechanism for women to be able to succeed on showing discrimination and putting the onus on the employer. When a woman is able to show that she is being paid less, the employer has to prove and establish that she isn't doing equal work. And so I would love to see this California law get expanded on a nationwide basis in order to provide some real security that women are going to be paid fairly when they go to work and not continue to be discriminated against. And this is another big difference between me and my opponent. He actually, when he was running in 2014, he actually said at a debate on video that his #1 priority was making sure that women got equal pay for equal work. And then he went to Congress and, of course, voted against paycheck fairness. And that's just a real problem. One, it's a signal, again, of how broken Washington is, where you make some promises and then you just ignore them. But it's also just not looking out for women and families in our district.
Right, absolutely. So moving on from women's issues, let's talk a little bit about a couple issues that are very important to millennials. Now, this election cycle especially, there's been one man who perhaps more than anyone else has energized the millennial base. That person was Bernie Sanders. After a very intense primary against Hillary Clinton, they had different plans on education, but they came to a compromise college plan. And that was to make colleges tuition-free for any family that earns under $125,000. Do you support that plan, and would you push for it in Congress, and how would you push for it if the Congress remains a Republican majority in the House?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, this is an issue that is very near and dear to my heart. You know, I'm a millennial. My wife and I graduated both within the last 10 years from law school and came out with mountains of debt. And we understand what it's like. We actually graduated, I came out of law school in 2008, I mean, the peak of the financial crisis. So I know what it's like to have that, you know, weight hanging around your neck with an uncertain job future and wondering how are you going to pay off these loans. And it just acts as an albatross around graduates who, you know, it can affect your life for decades into the future. So I support that plan. I've put out my own you know, student affordability plan. You can find it on my website that has some other ideas as well. I think that you need to have student debt dischargeable in bankruptcies, which right now you can't do it, and that's going to put some of the onus on banks and schools to make sure they're doing a good job teaching and preparing students to be able to get a job that can pay off their loans. I want to make sure we have better loan forgiveness regardless of what your family income might have been. If you go into public service, and I think of public service very broadly, if you're a teacher, if you're a firefighter, if you're a nurse, you can have your loans forgiven for every year that you do it, and then up to 10 years, then it's completely wiped away if you had any remaining. And want to really have plans like that so that people can go get the education they need and then work the career that's going to serve the community without worrying about how they're going to make that payment.
Right. So talk a little bit more about your plans for students who currently have the debt and don't want to go into public service. What would you propose to help them refinance their debt?
Well, sure. So that's another thing I support is refinancing so that you can bring the interest rate down. You know, right now you're not allowed to do that. You can refinance a car loan, a mortgage, credit card debt. For some reason, you can't do it with student loans. I want to get rid of that. And to go back to your initial statement, I support the plan of $125,000, making it debt-free. Even if we have a Republican majority in Congress, I think there is some room here for agreement. You know, Washington doesn't always work the way we would like it, and even good ideas, you know, they can't get through when they get, you know, held up by some obstructionists. But this can be a bipartisan issue. There's a group of young members of Congress who are trying to work together and trying to find solutions that we can come together on. This is going to improve our economy. It's going to get that money back into the communities where people live instead of just shipping them off to banks. That's going to be good for everyone. It's going to create more jobs. So hopefully it's something we can come together on. Okay,
fantastic. Another issue that's very important to millennials is the environment, because we're the ones that are going to have to deal with the impacts of climate change a couple decades down the road. We did sign the Paris Agreement last year, and it was a fantastic first step, but the International Business Times reports that even right now, the federal government gives $17.2 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Would you be open to moving some of those subsidies away from the fossil fuel industry and into the renewable energy and green technology industry?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a big thing I want to focus on, and right here in the 25th District, we got a lot of space and opportunity to really be leaders in the clean energy economic boom. And I want to make sure we're doing everything we can to do that. You know, climate change presents huge threats to our planet, and there's a lot we can do about it. And it is so frustrating to me when I hear people on the other side of the aisle or climate change deniers who say, no, 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 we can't be putting government money into renewable energies. We need to let the free market work. The free market is not what we have right now. What we have right now, as you said, are billions and billions of dollars go into the dirty energy companies. They're the ones who are being propped up right now. So let's create an even playing field, and that even playing field is going to be bringing more wind, more solar, you know, really trying to move in the renewable direction, which is going to be good economically. It's going to be good for the environment. We all win if we are leaders here in America on that issue.
Okay. Besides moving subsidies to the renewable energy industry, what else do you plan to do to combat climate change in Congress?
You know, there are a couple things that matter. Right here in the 25th, we had the Aliso Canyon gas leak. Actually, the 1-year anniversary of that leak is coming up on Sunday. This was not just bad on a local issue where you had 20,000 people who had to be relocated. It had catastrophic climate effects. The amount of methane gas that was released was just awful. And so I've proposed a piece of legislation, I call it the No Leak Act, which not only addresses what happened here, but puts safeguards in place so that the other 400 natural gas facilities across the country have better safety measures so that we don't have another leak like that. That will prevent, you know, so much methane being released. I also support, you know, tax incentives and tax credits for people to purchase more electric vehicles. I drive a Chevy Volt, which I wouldn't have been able to get without tax credits from both the state of California and the federal government to make a car like that more affordable, and providing those incentives for people to do that. Also, you know, adding you know, solar on houses that are new houses that are built. In the city of Lancaster here in the 25th, there's a $50,000 grant to synchronize their traffic lights. $50,000, a very small grant, and it's estimated that by synchronizing those lights, it's going to save 575,000 gallons of gas every year. That's incredible. Right. I mean, so that's a very small investment that is going to really bring down the amount of emissions right here in our community. Let's get grants like that. Let's have programs like that throughout the 25th, throughout the country, where we can start saving that unnecessary gas. And by the way, making it more convenient for people who have to drive, as it'll be easier and more efficient to travel through town.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the economy now. It's something that's very interconnected with the environment. One of the things that you've proposed to strengthen the economy and help low-income earners is to raise the minimum wage. How much would you raise the federal minimum wage by?
So right now, I support a $15 minimum wage, and I also support pegging it to inflation. And that's one of the real problems that we have.
How would you do that? Tying it to the CPI?
I mean, there are different ideas that you have out there in terms of doing it fairly, and I'd consider, you know, having it at a fair amount. But if you look at where the minimum wage was in 1968, it was the equivalent of $10.90. Right now, we're at $7.25.
Right.
We've had, you know, basically a reduction in income of a third at that minimum wage. So when people feel like they're working longer hours for less money, it's because they are. And at the same time, you've had CEO wages, you know, increase by 1,000%.
Right. They've been skyrocketing.
They've been skyrocketing, and that's not fair. It's not right. So I want to put it at a national level of $15, peg it to inflation, and make it so that people are able to keep up in our moving economy.
Right. So what would you say to people who say that raising the minimum wage is, you know, it's a good idea, but small businesses aren't going to be able to afford the wage increase? They're going to have to lay off some workers. How do you address that concern from the opposite side?
Yeah, you know, there's good evidence out there that when you do increase the minimum wage, you save money on training, you have reduced turnover, and you have more efficient workers. And all of those things work together to improve the economy. You also are getting more money put right back into the local community, because it is the minimum wage earners who are most likely to be spending every dollar they bring in, and they put it right back into the communities. Yeah, they're the ones who are spending the money at the restaurants, etc. So while a hamburger Happy Meal might go up in cost by a quarter, you're going to be able to sell a lot more of them because you have more people who can afford it. But the other thing that I think gets lost in this, when you're in California, California has already just passed a $15 minimum wage law. They have done it. And so when I'm sitting here thinking about protecting my constituents, my California small businesses, and wanting to make sure they're on an equal playing field when they compete against companies in other states, well, if you're having a lower minimum wage in another state, it means those companies are producing a product for less than our companies are producing a product.
Right.
So I want to make sure we have an even playing field for the companies in my community, and that means making it a nationwide level.
Okay. Another very contentious issue when it comes to the economy is free trade. Back in the 1990s, free trade used to be a bipartisan issue. Now it seems that both Democrats and Republicans have come up with protectionism fever. The free trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is one that both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders have had a lot of squabbles on. What's your position on ratifying the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
So I oppose the TPP. I'll say I support free and fair trade. I mean, we're going into a global economy. We can't close ourselves off, and we need to make sure that we do have trade, but we need to make sure it's fair trade. And I have two real big problems with the TPP. The first one, we kind of touched on it earlier, with the Porter Ranch gas leak. This methane gas leak is just terrible. It's natural gas.
Right.
Under the TPP, we would see a big increase in liquid natural gas exports and an increase in liquid natural gas production. I don't want to see that. We've been fed this story that natural gas was kind of a cleaner alternative energy.
To coal.
And people right here in the 25th have learned that's not true. And so I'm not going to support something that is going to increase the production and expansion of that dirty energy. Then you get to the other side of it, which are jobs. And this deal is not written in a fair enough manner to protect American jobs. It's going to result in our jobs being shipped to other countries. And I'm not going to support something that is going to hurt the American worker and American working families.
Okay. So a lot of the arguments that say that we're going to lose jobs, many economists disagree with that, saying we might lose jobs in, say, the manufacturing industry and gain jobs in the digital content production industry or the intellectual property industry. How do you respond to people who say that on net the TPP will create jobs here at home?
Yeah, I just think those stories are not right. I mean, I've looked into this significantly, and we're going to lose jobs, and we're going to lose good jobs. But we can, work on training our workers now, making sure that they are able to transition into the jobs of the future, so that as jobs are lost overseas, as they continue to be because of our, not TPP policy, but because of our unfair tax policy, we're continuing to lose jobs, and jobs are going overseas. So we need to make sure that we are training our employees so that they can transition as we lose jobs. And I've got a lot of, I don't know how much you want to go into things, but I have a lot of ideas in terms of changing our corporate tax policy to put American companies on a fairer playing field against multinationals and foreign companies, which would help keep more jobs in America as opposed to shipping them overseas.
So what are those policies? Would you be in favor of raising the corporate tax rates, eliminating certain loopholes?
Yeah, so what I would like to see is moving to what's called a formulary apportionment model, where you tax based on the sales in the United States, as opposed to taxing as we do now based on the assets, the employees, and the profits. Because what you have when you tax based on profits are a bunch of companies who pack their patents in, say, Northern Ireland and say, oh, that's where I earned my profit, Northern Ireland. They sold 90% of their stuff here in America and claim all the profit in Northern Ireland. Let's tax based on the sales. No company wants to get away from the American consumer. We have great power. And so we're going to bring in revenue from those multinationals, and it's going to put our American companies on an even playing field. Because right now, a company that is only in America doesn't game the system. They have to pay taxes on everything. 100% of their profits are right here. but it lets and it actually incentivizes a company to open up a new business, a new warehouse in another country so they can claim that's where the profit came from. That's how the system's being gamed. So I say let's support our American companies. If you did that, you could actually lower the corporate tax rate and still bring in more revenue, and you would actually bring in enough new revenue to pay for free college education for everybody just by making that change.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of the economy and American workers, some of the most hard-hit American workers in recent years have been seniors. Now, when we talk about Social Security specifically, your opponent, Congressman Knight, has said that, quote, Social Security was a bad idea, end quote. And you happen to disagree, as we discussed prior to the interview. This Congressional Budget Office explains that the Social Security trust funds that are funded through the Federal Insurance Contribution Act taxes will be financially insolvent by the year between 2029 to 2036. Now, of course, you support not cutting benefits and expanding these benefits, but how do you make Social Security solvent so that we can pay for those benefits out of the Social Security trust funds?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think Social Security, far from being a bad idea, is one of the greatest ideas in American history. When you look at the year before Social Security was passed, the senior poverty rate was near 80%. Right now it's under 9%. It has lifted tens of millions of American seniors out of poverty. Today it lifts 2 to 3 million children out of poverty. I mean, this is a great program, and we need to make sure it is there and funded long enough so that you are able to collect Social Security and everybody watching this can collect Social Security. So if you were to lift the cap, right now at $118,500, they stop collecting Social Security tax, which is then a regressive tax, because a person who makes $50,000, a family who makes $50,000,
entire 12.4%.
they pay it, and a person who makes $25 million pays no taxes after that $118,500. If you lift the cap, Social Security will remain fully and completely funded for another 60 years into the future. That's a very small change. It affects no more than 7% of the families in America, and it will fund us for another 6 decades.
Okay. So when you say lift the cap, do you want to raise the cap of income that's eligible to be taxed by the payroll tax, or just eliminate the cap totally and tax all income?
Well, there are a bunch of different solutions. You can either get rid of it at 118 and put all. You can have a donut hole between 118 and 250. Some say 118 and 400, and then take it up as far as it goes. So I want it to go up as far as it goes, and then I would support a lifting, a raising to 250, a raising to 400, depending on what we are able to get through, depending on the makeup of the House and Senate.
Okay. And one last question before we move on to foreign policy. With regards to eliminating the cap, do you think it's politically feasible for example, in a scenario where the Senate is Democratic majority and the House is a Republican majority, to eliminate that cap without raising the retirement age or means testing benefits or making some compromise to the Republicans to at least raise the retirement age for people who will be seniors in a couple decades down the road?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not going to support raising the retirement age. For the people who need Social Security most of all are the people who have not seen an increase in life expectancy the way the people who don't need Social Security as much have. They're the people who are working, hard jobs, who are out there every day using their hands, busting their bums in order to take care of their families, and they're not seeing the same increase in life expectancy. And so we can't just increase the age for them. So we'll see what happens depending on the makeup. And frankly, Washington is broken, and good ideas don't go through the way they should. But I'm hopeful that we'll be able to come up with these solutions that are going to benefit the vast, vast majority of Americans, and people will be able to put aside some of their ideological holdups and actually put America first.
Well, that's very good to hear, and let's hope that happens. Moving on to foreign policy now. Recently, as you probably know, a broad coalition of Iraqi forces, Kurdish Peshmerga forces, even some American Special Operations Forces, certain tribes within the region, they've all launched a massive offensive to retake Mosul from ISIS. Now, most foreign policy experts agree that this is certainly going to happen. We're going to take back Mosul, whether it be in a couple of weeks or in a couple of months. What would you do in Congress? Because you'll be, hopefully, if you get elected, you'll be in Congress by that time. What would you do to make sure that we keep Mosul, that we make sure it's stable enough so it doesn't fall back into the hands of an extremist group?
Right. The first thing that I will admit right off the bat is, unlike Donald Trump, I don't believe I know more than the generals. And so the first thing I'm going to do when I get in is listen to our military experts. And a big part of this is going to depend on how does the offensive go? How easy is it to take it back? What is the situation of troops on the ground? Where did those who fled Mosul go? That's going to be a fluid situation. So I don't think you can really say in advance, oh, this is the way to hold it. Right. I think we have to look at what has happened to take it, and then listen to our generals, listen to the defense experts, the intelligence agencies, and have them say, here's what we need to do to make sure that we hold it, and here's what we need to do to continue our offensive against ISIL to make sure we are taking them out and eliminating what I believe is the greatest threat facing America right now.
Okay, and you just briefly touched upon where these people are going to go after the offensive, and I assume you were talking about some of the civilians in Mosul, correct?
Well, I'm talking about the civilians is one issue. Right. I'm talking about the fighters who we're taking it back from, and where they are going to flee to, and because already many of them have fled, and I assume more of them will as we continue the onslaught and as we take over the city. So then the question is, okay, where have they gone? Where have they set up shop? And how do we get them there?
With regards to first the fighters, we'll talk about the civilians right after this. The fighters, one of the things that many experts say is to pursue them effectively, we're going to need to make sure that the Kurdish Peshmerga forces and the Turkish forces work together in our coalition. Right now, the Turks and the Kurds really do hate each other. So how do we make sure that those two groups work together to combat ISIL?
Yeah, and this is another situation where I think we look at the experts. We get our diplomats and we get our military experts who try to keep that coalition intact and try to get across to everybody that the only way this happens is if we are able to work as allies against a dangerous enemy to protect all of our greater good. And that's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take experts who have been on the ground, who are working with all of the people involved so that we can get the best and safest solution.
Okay. Now, talking about the civilians, the United Nations has said that they're expecting tens of thousands of civilians to be fleeing from Mosul as a result of the offensive. And this is just a small drop in the bucket compared to the hundreds of thousands of refugees that are fleeing the Middle East because of this violence. Do you think that the United States should increase its acceptance of these refugees that are fleeing extremism?
Here's what I'll say is the number one responsibility of the federal government is always to protect the national security of the country.
Right.
And so we need to have very good vetting in place, and we need to make sure that dangerous people are not entering our country. But we have to remember America's place in this world and what America's place has always been in this world. And America has always been a country that has stepped up and answered the call to respond to and address the great global challenges facing this world. And now is not the time for us to turn our back on that. And so we can protect our country, we can secure our borders, and we can still answer the call and be the global leader we need to be.
Absolutely. Would you propose any specific changes to the vetting process that refugees go through to make it safer for American people here at home who are going to be living with the refugees who come into the country?
We have a very extensive vetting process right now where you are going through multiple different agencies and getting sign-off with extensive medical backgrounds, criminal background. There are a lot of checks in place, and there are specific timelines in place where if you don't get to the next step fast enough, you have to go back to the first step. It's extensive vetting. But this is another one where if the intelligence agencies come to us in Congress and say, we want to make this change because it's going to make America safer, then I want to hear that. But off the bat, I'm not saying we need to do A, B, or C. We have extensive vetting in place, and we just need to keep extensive vetting that is going to protect our borders.
Okay, fantastic. Now let's talk a little bit about criminal justice. There are two major criminal justice reform bills in Congress that have stalled, and they had a lot of bipartisan support at the beginning of the year, but they've stalled in committee. The first is the Solitary Confinement Reform Act, Senator Richard Durman from Illinois, and that would limit the use of solitary confinement in federal prisons. The second is the Sentencing Reform Act by Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, and that would reduce mandatory minimums and 3 strikes laws. Do you support these bills? And if you do, how would you make sure that they're advanced and passed in Congress? If you don't, what's the problem with the legislation?
Sure. So starting with solitary confinement. There are a lot of really, really horrific stories out there.
Right.
And we need to make sure that we are not torturing people, that we are not going above and beyond what is necessary to have secure and safe facilities. And so I have not read that specific bill, right. But I do believe we need to take steps in order to cut down, if not eliminate, solitary confinement in federal prisons. When it comes to the sentencing guidelines, you mentioned it at the beginning. I worked for a federal judge on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and almost half the cases we deal with were criminal sentencing or immigration cases, and you just see kind of how broken both of the systems are. I believe in giving discretion to federal judges in order to allow them to weigh all of the facts, right. And not force people into plea bargains because they're so worried about what mandatory minimum they could face if it gets bumped up. So I support giving more discretion there. One thing that I think that the media really glossed over, in I believe the bill you're talking about, the Grassley bill, is that it actually increased some of the mandatory minimums for some types of crimes. And so I think it needs to have a closer examination to see if the bill is actually doing what needs to be done. So I can just say at the broadest level, I support reform. I support taking steps to give judges more discretion to actually consider the specific facts in a case and hope that there's a way to do it on a bipartisan basis in both the House and Senate so we can move forward on that.
Fantastic. The other issue with criminal justice is police brutality. Now, if I take out my phone right now and iOS 10, sorry, it's going to take a bit to get used to this. But if I go to the Washington Post's police shootings tracker, as it's loading, it's showing that in 2016 so far, 776 people, have been killed by police officers so far in 2016. Now, obviously, many of these deaths were unavoidable, and obviously, most police officers deserve our utmost respect for the unwavering courage they show protecting us. But the fact that this number is 776 is indicative of a problem. How do we solve this problem?
Yeah, it's tragic, and it seems like every day we turn on the news and there are more and more stories of senseless killings by civilians and by law enforcement. And what's really unfortunate in the situation is the lack of trust that the community has right now. And there's only so much you can do at the federal level for this, but there are some things you can do, and one is to provide more resources for effective training, for effective community policing, so that in departments across the country, we're making sure that our law enforcement are the best trained and best equipped in order to do their jobs. And we need to remember the real sacrifice that our law enforcement take. Just last week, I was at the memorial service for Sergeant Owen, a Lancaster sheriff's deputy who was killed in the line of duty. And at that service, there were 4,000 to 5,000 law enforcement personnel in uniform there honoring this great man. And it really brings home the risk that each one of these people takes every day they put on their uniform. And the vast majority of work that our law enforcement do is done well, is done safely. And so what I would really like to have happen is help with funding for body cameras for all law enforcement personnel across the country. And what that does is protect law enforcement when they act appropriately. In the 99 out of 100 circumstances, when everything was done by the book, you have evidence of it and you know that it happened. But it gives the community confidence as well to know that in that 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000, whatever the case may be, we're going to find out what happened, and we're going to make sure that there is accountability when it does happen. And hopefully, gradually over time, with better training, with body cameras, with effective community policing, you can start to bring the two, the law enforcement and our communities closer together to have more trust both ways, so that it's safer for everybody out there.
So absolutely, body cameras would, you're saying, make sure that frivolous complaints are dealt with immediately and the police officers don't get prosecuted. But in the cases that they are on the wrong side, they're prosecuted with the evidence there. My follow-up to this is, how does Congress allocate funding and give it to the states? And with regards to, for example, say Missouri, if they don't want to have these body cameras, how would that funding work? How would we give them the funding and make sure that they use it for body cameras specifically?
Well, there are a lot of different ways to go about it, but I mean, most law enforcement out there have said they want body cameras. And so you can make the funding available. It can be earmarked just for a specific thing. I mean, there are a lot of ways the federal government provides incentives. Yeah, to say if you want funding for X, then use this other funding for Y. I mean, there are a lot of ways to make it work, and I think we would, Congress would hold hearings, would talk to, attorney generals or whatever the case may be to find out the best way to implement it. But it certainly is doable, and we just need to find the most effective way to do it.
So let's close off with a little talk about the election. Now,
Sure.
Vox, Ezra Klein's newspaper, and Real Clear Politics both came out recently and said that if there's enough turnout on the Democratic side for just the presidential election for Hillary Clinton, there's a chance that not only can we take the Senate, which we're favored to, but the Democrats can also win over the House. How likely do you think that is?
I'll leave the predicting to the talking heads. Right. It is. I can tell you, as being one candidate in this really exciting election, it's fun and it's interesting. But really, all I'm focusing on is my election right here in this community, and spending the next 18 days talking to as many people as possible, getting our positive message out, and seeing what we can do to bring people here out to the polls. And I'll leave it up to the other 434 candidates out there to decide how to do what they can do to win. And I'm going to focus on trying to win mine.
Okay, and assuming you do win, what would Bryan Caforio's priorities, legislative priorities, be in Congress? We talked about a lot of different issues today. What would be some of your top priorities?
So start with the first thing, which is that I said the federal government's number one role is to protect America. Right. And so you're going to listen to the experts, and when funding or tools are necessary to protect America, we're going to make sure to provide it. And then the real reason I'm running for Congress is, my parents were public school teachers. I went to public schools my whole life. That gave me the opportunity to go to UCLA, where I met my wife, to go to Yale, to work for a federal judge, to have a successful legal practice. And I just saw a system broken, a system where far too many people are being taken advantage of because the rules were written that way for the big banks, for the big corporations, not for people in the community. So everything I want to do is about building an economy that works for everyone and not just the wealthy few. And that starts with, and we talked about it a little earlier, but total and complete women's equality. Because unless women are given that opportunity to control their own health care decisions, they can't fully decide how they want to participate in our economy. Unless they are given fair pay for fair work, equal pay for equal work, they aren't being able to fully participate in our economy. And so we need to make sure that women have complete equality. And so I support, pro-women, pro-family policies, and want to make sure we get that through. I also support comprehensive immigration reform, because right now we have 11 to 12 million people who are living in the shadows, who are unable to fully participate in our economy because of the way it's set up right now. I want to make sure we're fighting for families, we're keeping families together, and that we are giving an opportunity for those people who are here, who are otherwise following the law, who want to learn English and participate in our society, to be able to do so. And it's not only morally right, it's going to reduce the deficit by upwards of $900 billion. And Secretary Clinton has said that in her first 100 days, she wants to get something like this through. So I fully support that and want to work on that. We also talked on Social Security and Medicare. This is another way that getting more money to our seniors, which is a huge percentage of the population, is going to put more money into our communities. It's going to improve our economy, and it is going to help create jobs in our local area.
Absolutely. And so finally, one last question with regards to millennials in this election. A lot of them, plenty of them, are absolutely disgusted by Donald Trump, but plenty of them are also, they dislike Hillary Clinton, and they're not sure whether to vote for Hillary Clinton, whether to abstain, whether to vote for a third-party candidate. What would you say to those millennials?
Yeah, well, first, with regards to Donald Trump, I'm glad people are disgusted, because this is a man who is running the most bigoted, racist, misogynistic campaign in the history of presidential politics in the United States. And he's not just saying horrific things. It has become very clear that this man is a sexual predator. And we cannot allow him to get into the Oval Office. And so we need to do everything we can to prevent that from happening. But what would really just excite me about millennials is if they vote. If we come out and vote, whoever you're voting for, it's going to lead to a better system. It's going to make your elected officials and politicians listen to what we want and what we care about. Because when 40 to 50% of people under 30 don't vote, it shouldn't be that surprising then when elected officials in Washington don't listen to the concerns of the under 30 crowd. So let's get out there, let's vote, let's make sure that our politicians have to listen to what we care about. Whoever it is you're voting for, if you're voting, politicians and elected officials will start listening, and that will lead to a better society for young people as we go forward.
Absolutely. Everyone should go register to vote, and there will be a link in the description to help you get registered to vote if you're in California. The deadline is, I believe, October 24th.
Yeah, you're running out of time, so do it quickly.
Do it quickly. But other than that, thank you so much, Bryan, for joining us today.
Thank
Do you have any last words to say to the camera?
No, just get out there and vote. It's great when young people are engaged. We have a better economy and a better democracy when everybody participates. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for creating the Institute.
Thank you. I appreciate it.